For Daniel, this solo journey was supposed to be the adventure of a lifetime. A cheerful, curious 10-year-old, he had been looking forward to this day with gleaming eyes and a heart full of excitement. He dressed carefully in a white shirt with little airplanes, the gift from his grandpa, who shared his love for flying. With his bright red sneakers and a small plane-shaped pendant from his mother around his neck, he felt ready to take on the skies. Standing in the bustling airport beside his mother, he could hardly contain his enthusiasm. As she straightened his collar, she reminded him to be polite and listen to the flight attendants. "I know, Mom," he replied, trying to sound brave, though a bit of nervousness bubbled beneath his excitement. Finally, the moment arrived. After a last warm hug, Daniel waved to his mom, ready to step onto the plane and soar into the sky. As he approached the boarding gate, his heart fluttered. He imagined the thrill of watching the world grow smaller from his window seat. However, his excitement dimmed when he was greeted by a flight attendant, a woman named Martha. She looked him over with a scrutinizing, almost cold expression. "Where's your guardian?" she asked, her tone sharp and her eyes unkind. "Oh, I'm flying by myself," he said politely, holding up his ticket with a hopeful smile. She took the ticket, hesitated, and then, with an indifferent voice, waved him forward, her gaze still hard on him. Once seated, Daniel took out his toy airplane, hoping to play a little before takeoff. But before he could enjoy his tiny moment of fun, Martha returned. "Put that away and sit properly," she snapped, her voice loud enough to make nearby passengers glance over. Embarrassed, Daniel quickly complied, feeling small and unsure. As the plane began to move, he tried to ignore the uncomfortable feeling growing within him. This was supposed to be his adventure, his magical journey through the sky. But he couldn't shake off the unease, lingering like a shadow. Little did he know, this was only the beginning of a journey that would change everything. The plane rumbled as it began to taxi down the runway. Daniel, seated by the window, watched with fascination, feeling the excitement return. He imagined telling his grandparents all about the flight, the takeoff, the view from above, everything he'd dreamed about for so long. Yet, Martha's harsh words replayed in his mind, casting a small shadow over his excitement. As the engines roared and the plane lifted off the ground, Daniel's heart skipped a beat. He pressed his nose against the window, marveling as the world below grew smaller. The clouds floated by like soft, inviting pillows. This was it, the moment he'd been waiting for. But just as he was beginning to feel comfortable, Martha appeared again. She stood in the aisle, watching him with the same cold, hard expression. "Sit properly," she ordered sharply, noticing his awe-filled gaze out the window. Daniel hesitated, then nodded, adjusting himself in his seat, afraid to make any wrong move. For the rest of the flight, he couldn't relax. Martha continued to walk by, her eyes never meeting his, but her presence an ever-present reminder that something was amiss. He saw her smile at other passengers, even laugh with one man about his oversized hat. But when her gaze fell on him, her face tightened and any hint of warmth disappeared. Daniel's heart felt heavy. He didn't understand why she was treating him this way. He'd been polite, just like his mom had reminded him. He hadn't caused any trouble. All he wanted was to enjoy this flight, to feel like a real traveler, like the adults he'd seen on TV. As the plane neared its destination, Martha approached his row one last time. She leaned down, and in a quiet but firm voice said, "You'll need to gather your things and leave the plane as soon as we land." Daniel's eyes widened. "But why?" Without explanation, she stood up and walked away, leaving him stunned, his heart pounding with confusion and fear. He'd done nothing wrong. Why was this happening? When the plane finally touched down, Daniel did as she had instructed. As he exited, he clutched his backpack, feeling a deep, inexplicable hurt inside. This wasn't how he'd imagined his first solo flight, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something more was behind Martha's coldness. Daniel sat alone in the crowded terminal, clutching his backpack as tears streamed down his cheeks. His heart was heavy with confusion and shame. He'd been so excited, so ready for this journey, but it had ended abruptly, leaving him feeling small and rejected. Just then, he heard a familiar voice. "Daniel?" His mom's voice trembled as she rushed to his side, kneeling beside him. She wrapped her arms around him, holding him close, her face a mixture of concern and anger. "What happened, sweetheart? I thought you were on the plane." His lip quivered, and he struggled to find the words. "The lady, the flight attendant, she made me get off," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "She said I was causing trouble, but Mom, I didn't do anything. I was just sitting there." His mom's face paled, her eyes narrowing with anger. "She did what?" she whispered, fury simmering in her voice. "You've always been so polite, Daniel. In fact, I know you wouldn't cause any trouble." She hugged him tighter, her heart aching for him. Around them, passengers who had been on the flight glanced their way, some whispering to each other. One elderly woman approached and placed a gentle hand on Daniel's shoulder. "You were very brave, young man," she said kindly, giving him a reassuring smile before walking away. Yet Daniel didn't feel brave. He felt small, hurt, and deeply confused. Meanwhile, back on the plane, Martha continued her work as if nothing unusual had happened. She handed out drinks, chatted with passengers, and even laughed at a few jokes. But occasionally, a flicker of something crossed her face, a hint of satisfaction. She believed she'd successfully handled the situation. Little did she know, her actions were about to unravel in ways she never anticipated. Back in the terminal, Daniel's mom marched up to the airline counter, anger flashing in her eyes as she held his hand tightly. "I need to speak to someone in charge," she demanded, her voice firm. "My son was kicked off his flight without reason, and I won't leave until I get answers." The staff at the counter exchanged nervous glances, nodding sympathetically. "Please, ma'am, have a seat. We'll get a supervisor for you right away." Daniel's mom knelt beside him again, her expression softening. "Listen to me, Daniel," she said gently, holding his face in her hands. "You didn't do anything wrong. Sometimes people act unkindly, but it's not about you. We're going to get to the bottom of this, I promise." With his mom by his side, Daniel felt a flicker of hope. But as he looked around the bustling terminal, he couldn't shake the question burning in his heart. Why had Martha been so cruel to him? As they waited by the counter, Daniel's mother clenched his hand, her determination shining through her anger. She would not let this go, not after seeing her son's crushed spirit. Just as promised, a man in a crisp suit approached, introducing himself as Mr. Harris, the airline supervisor. His expression was grave as he listened attentively to Daniel's mom recount the entire ordeal. How Daniel had been mistreated by Martha, the way she'd forced him off the plane without cause, and the lasting impact it had on her young, innocent son. Mr. Harris looked down at Daniel, still clutching his backpack with red-rimmed eyes, and his face grew serious. "I'm truly sorry this happened to you, Daniel. We're going to look into this immediately," he promised, his tone resolute. After a brief conversation with the crew, Mr. Harris returned, his face solemn. "We're reviewing the flight footage now," he explained. "In the meantime, we'd like to offer Daniel a new ticket, free of charge, on the next available flight." But Daniel's mom wasn't satisfied. "And what about that flight attendant? Will she just get away with this?" she demanded, her voice shaking with emotion. Mr. Harris hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "We're committed to investigating this thoroughly. If there's evidence of wrongdoing, we'll take appropriate action. Please understand, we have policies we must follow to ensure fairness for everyone." Daniel's mom took a deep breath, calming herself for Daniel's sake, and nodded. She knew this was only the beginning of the fight, but she wouldn't back down. As she led Daniel away from the counter, her resolve hardened. She was not going to let this incident fade quietly. That night, Daniel's mom took her quest for justice online, sharing their story. Her post described the hurt her son felt, the unfairness of his treatment, and her determination to hold the airline accountable. Within hours, her story began to spread, reaching friends, family, and eventually strangers who felt moved by young Daniel's ordeal. Messages poured in, expressions of support, stories from others who had also experienced similar mistreatment, and encouragement for her to keep fighting. Meanwhile, Martha had no idea of the storm brewing against her. She went about her duties, assuming the situation had been resolved. But the airline was already piecing together complaints from other flights and noting a troubling pattern. Each story shared a similar theme. Martha had been unfair, particularly to children traveling alone, dismissing their innocence with harshness. The following morning, Daniel's mom received a call from Mr. Harris. His voice was cautious but determined. "We've conducted our initial review, and it appears we do have cause for further investigation. Rest assured, Mrs. Evans, this won't be ignored." Hanging up the phone, Daniel's mom hugged him tightly. "They're going to make it right," she whispered, a hopeful smile crossing her face. But in her heart, she knew that the real battle for justice was only just beginning. The next morning, Daniel awoke with a mix of nerves and excitement. Today, he'd be flying again, thanks to the new ticket arranged by Mr. Harris. But this time, his mom had made sure everything would be different. She had been up late, reaching out to contacts and preparing for this moment, determined that no other child would suffer the way her son had. When they arrived at the airport, things immediately felt different. As they approached the airline counter, a friendly staff member greeted them with a warm smile. "Good morning, Daniel. We've been expecting you. Please, come with me," she said, her voice kind and reassuring. Daniel exchanged a surprised look with his mom, but they followed the staff member down a quiet hallway, away from the usual crowd. She led them to a special room near the gate, where screens showed various parts of the airport, almost like a control center. Daniel's mom had never seen anything like it, and Daniel was both curious and a little intimidated. Inside, Mr. Harris and a group of serious-looking individuals waited. They all stood when Daniel and his mom entered, and Mr. Harris approached them with a gentle smile. "Welcome back, Daniel," he said warmly. "We want you to have a wonderful flight today. But before you board, there's something important we need to discuss." His mom nodded, her expression solemn but hopeful. She could sense they were finally getting the answers they deserved. Mr. Harris explained that after their complaint, the airline had thoroughly reviewed the footage from Daniel's previous flight. They saw how Martha had treated him, her cold, dismissive behavior compared to the kindness she'd shown other passengers. He shook his head, clearly troubled. "What happened was wrong, and we deeply apologize," he said, his gaze sincere. "We've taken steps to make sure Martha won't be working on any flights today." Daniel's eyes widened. "So, she's gone?" he asked, a small hint of relief in his voice. But a part of him still felt nervous. What if someone else treated him the same way? Mr. Harris nodded. "Yes, Daniel, and there's something more. We want to share your story, if you're okay with that, so that others can learn from this and make sure it never happens again." Daniel looked up at his mom, who gave his hand a reassuring squeeze. He thought of how scared he'd felt, how his first solo adventure had turned into a nightmare, and he didn't want anyone else to feel the same. "All right," he said softly, his voice determined. "I'll do it." Soon after, Daniel found himself back on the plane, but this time, everything felt right. Passengers gave him warm smiles, and the staff treated him with kindness. Just before takeoff, Mr. Harris's voice came over the intercom, addressing the passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to acknowledge a very brave young passenger, Daniel, who's flying with us today. Thanks to him, we are making changes to ensure a safer, kinder experience for everyone." As the announcement ended, Daniel felt the weight of every passenger's gaze, but this time it felt different. He felt brave and proud, knowing his story had made a difference. And soon a surprise would make this flight truly unforgettable. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Daniel settled into his seat, feeling a strange mixture of pride and relief. His heart still raced, but the fear had melted away, replaced by a sense of accomplishment. This time, the flight felt like the adventure he had originally imagined, but even more meaningful. Just as he began to relax, a new voice came over the intercom. "Good morning, everyone," the pilot announced warmly. "Today, we have a special passenger on board. Daniel, would you join me up here in the cockpit for a moment?" Daniel's eyes widened in surprise. The passengers turned to look at him, smiling and clapping, and his mom gave him an encouraging nod. He rose from his seat, hardly daring to believe it, and followed a flight attendant to the front of the plane. The pilot greeted him with a grin, kneeling down to look him in the eyes. "I heard about everything you went through, and I'm proud of how brave you've been," he said, placing a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "Would you like to see how we fly the plane?" Daniel's eyes sparkled. "Really?" he whispered, hardly able to contain his excitement. The pilot led him into the cockpit. A world filled with screens, buttons, and lights, each one more fascinating than the last. The pilot pointed to a small switch. "Would you like to press the button to turn on the seatbelt sign?" he asked with a smile. Daniel's heart pounded as he reached out, his fingers trembling with excitement as he activated the sign. Before they returned to the cabin, the pilot handed Daniel the microphone. "Would you like to say hello to everyone?" he asked, giving him an encouraging nod. Daniel took a deep breath, gripping the microphone tightly. "Hi everyone. I'm Daniel, and thank you for flying with me today. I'm excited to visit my grandparents, and I hope we all have a wonderful trip together." His voice started out shaky, but grew stronger with each word, and when he finished, the cabin erupted in applause. Back in his seat, Daniel looked out the window as the plane soared into the sky, feeling lighter than he ever had before. He no longer felt the burden of fear or hurt. Instead, he felt powerful, like he had taken control of his journey, despite the challenges he'd faced. Meanwhile, back on the ground, the airline's investigation into Martha continued. Other passengers had come forward, sharing their own experiences with her, and the airline was now committed to making things right. Martha, once so sure of herself, now faced the consequences of her actions. Her treatment of Daniel had sparked a change, one she could no longer ignore. When the plane touched down and Daniel disembarked, Mr. Harris was waiting at the gate. He handed Daniel a certificate, officially naming him an honorary co-pilot for the day. "Thank you for being brave, Daniel. Because of you, we're making changes to ensure everyone is treated with kindness and respect." As they left the airport, Daniel held the certificate tightly, a smile on his face. He had started this journey with excitement, only to face unexpected cruelty. But he had risen above it, and now his story had helped to protect others. As he walked hand in hand with his mom, he glanced up at the sky, feeling that anything was possible. Maybe one day he would return as a real pilot, ready to make every journey one filled with kindness, respect, and courage. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you won't miss any of our latest videos. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them below. Thank you all for taking the time to watch, and see you in the next video.